This is fun. I started recording these with Methow at home and Deirdre on December 13th. And these are all stories that are not in the book, The Whole Damn Valley. I wanted to just read the list of the stories I read on December 13th. So when you go to the YouTube, if you want to listen to them, if you didn't, here's who I wrote about. Joe Yoakum, Claude Miller, Deke Smith, Prudy Imes, Millie Bagwell, and then 4 little short excerpts from Carolyn Hotchkiss, Perry Clark, Jean Carroll Hansen, and Charlie Schmidt, Sr. And last week, before the technological breakdown, I read about Helen Smith. And then I was halfway through Frank Carroll when my computer gave up the ghost. Today, I want to tell you who I'm going to read about so that I'm going to finish Frank Carroll and then a short little piece about Frank Thurlow, and then Stan and Edna Darwood, Sylvia Christensen, Bucky Buckmaster, Virgil Webb, and if we have time, Gladys Waymeyer. So I will start with, last week I was halfway through reading about Frank Carroll, who led a very interesting life. He was here in the Valley in 19... Are we okay?
Yeah, when people come on, they're not muted, and so it does that. Sorry about that.
No problem. So Frank Carroll came to the Valley as a young child in 1911, and he spent most of his life on the high seas, going around the world as an engineer, and so here's a story. I was halfway through this story, but I'm going to start from the beginning of it. I mean, the episode. So Frank Carroll, he'd been working as a salmon trap watcher in Union Bay in Alaska, and he was sitting on the shore one day with his partner when about 50 pounds of ugly-looking glob floated to their feet. Ambergris, Frank hopes. Now, ambergris is a regurgitation from a sperm whale, which is used as a perfume base and was at that time worth about $1,000 a pound. $50,000 just wafts up to these 2 men as they sit on a beach in southern Alaska. But of course, there was some doubt as to whether or not it was really ambergris, so they sent a bid over to Ketchikan to have it analyzed, and the bad news comes back. It is merely whale liver. Dreams dashed, Frank proceeded to extract the oil from the blob, and eventually, on his return to the lower 48, gave the oil to his father to grease his harnesses and gear around the farm. 13 years later, Frank is back in Alaska on a freighter as a licensed officer, stops to see the boss he had when he was a trap watcher, and this Mr. Harris informs him that the stuff actually had been ambergris after all. And there was his father down in Prosser, greasing his leather with $50,000 oil. There are few ports in the world that Frank hasn't at least passed in the night, and now he has come to port for good back in the Methow Valley. He has no desire to ever look at another pressure gauge or visit another port. He is home. On the front page of The Living Dunes, a book which Ron McLean wrote, Ron has written, "To Frank, who remembers the Methow as I do, when the roads were quiet places, hard work was respected, and the fields held promise." Okay. This is a little excerpt from the article that I wrote about Frank Thurlow for the Methow Valley News, April 28th, 1977. The first voting in the Methow Valley was held in the log cabin of Frank Thurlow's father, Mason Thurlow. It was the presidential election of November 1888 when Benjamin Harrison was elected president over the incumbent Grover Cleveland. Every resident of the entire valley came to vote, all 9 of them. Mason killed a deer and served a dinner of venison stew and beaver tail to all the voters. Mason used to tell about the earliest years of this valley when there were many men and few women. There was, he said, a Lonely Hearts booklet, which had the names and addresses of men and women looking for other men and women. One man in the valley supposedly sent one of these ladies $300 for her travel fare from Virginia. She arrived and they got married. He was later talking to a lonely bachelor friend of his and said, "Hey, I think I know where you can get a woman for $150. This friend responded, "And what would I get for $150 if you got yours for $300? Okay, this is the story about Stanley and Edna Darwood from the Methow Valley News, November 17th, 1977. And in this story, you will hear where I got the title for my book, The Whole Damn Valley. Edna Darwood, full of laughter and alertness at 81, takes my questions head on. Stanley, 88, her husband of 55 years, settles deep into the overstuffed chair. Was it love at first sight, Edna? I ask, innocently enough. No, definite, matter of fact. It wasn't? I'm a little startled at the answer. No, it wasn't. But she's smiling. My friends and I laughed at him because he was short and fat. We called him Humpty Dumpty. I looked quickly over to Stanley to see how he's taking this. Yeah, that's right. She wasn't much on short, stout people. I had a lot of chasing to do. She was slim, a real model, says Stanley. I'm handed a picture of Edna at the age of 20, and her beauty is striking. Stanley and Edna met, unromantically enough, at an apple packing shed in Peshastin in 1919. They married 2.5 years later and have lived together for more than half a century. And the way they talk about it, their life together has been full of good, even though work happened to be their middle name. The odyssey of Stanley's life up to the time he met Edna is an adventure story that ranges from England across the sea, across the continent, until he found himself in the apple shed in Peshastin, Washington, and wound up living the rest of his life in the Methow Valley. I was born in 1880 in the little burgh of Upwood, England, about 100 miles west of London. I was born in a pub, baptized an Episcopalian, and at the age of 11, I was confirmed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Till I left England, I lived in that pub. When I turned 16, I got some money from the estate, went to Liverpool, paid for my passage to New York City. When we got to America, we were quarantined in the harbor for 4 whole days. All we could see was the Statue of Liberty. I know that statue well from having looked at it for so long. When we finally debarked, I got my money changed to nickels and dimes and got a room and board. I got a job right away. Let's see. Putting in the New York sewer system, digging ditches 6 feet deep. Here his story ranges from Chicago to the Dakotas, back to Chicago, to Montana, to West Virginia, to France during World War I, where he was a horse veterinarian. It was in Chicago that Stanley picked up the saying, "Ah, baby, how she loves," each time he takes the first swig from any beverage. This saying is carefully taught to each succeeding generation of Darwoods, and it tickles Stanley to hear those words coming from his toddling great-grandchildren as they lift their glasses of milk. Ah, baby, how she loves. Eventually, after the war, he ended up in Quincy visiting a brother. From there, they decided to work in the apples, thus the convoluted route he took to Peshastin, where he met Edna. Edna Fender was one of the first white children to be born in the Methow Valley in 1896 on the Texas Creek homestead of Andrew Link and Effie Lou Fender. I asked Edna what she thought had drawn her parents to the valley in 1894. It was Stanley who answered. "The whole damn valley was here," he roared. "That's what was here." Then he got more serious. This was homesteading country. That was the drawing card. For 2 years, the Fender homestead was the stage station for the stagecoaches and freight wagons that traveled the mountainous roads between Pateros and Winthrop. And here the story goes into the early life of Edna until her life eventually converges in Peshastin with Stanley's. In 1920, Stanley bought land north of Carlton, and by 1922 had built a 7-room home. They proceeded to have 6 head of kids. All 6 still live and work in the valley, as do 16 of their 20 grandchildren and 14 of their 20 great-grandchildren. Most of Edna and Stanley's children left the valley at one time or another to live in other places, but all of them have returned. Says Effie May, their oldest, "We just didn't find any place we liked better." The Darwood's roots run deep in the Methow Valley. And May Darwood, who was the editor of the Methow Valley News at this time, she used to write a little column. And this is from her. See, it was about Effie Lou Fender. Okay, this is Sylvie, Edna Darwood's mother. So now Effie Lou Fender came to the valley in 1894, and she died at the age of 96 in 1965. And this is what May wrote. "To this woman, whose life had spanned from crossing the continent in a covered wagon to seeing man land on the moon, television was something beyond her comprehension. The people inside that box were real. So real, in fact, that she would tell her daughter to get those terrible people out of the house right now, and follow that up with a lecture on how she'd raised her children better than that." This is a story. It's actually, it was supposed to be about Sylvia Christensen, but it's a lot of it's about her father, Ulrich Fries, who wrote the book from Copenhagen to Okanagan. Anyway, so this is Sylvia Christensen. I wrote it for the Methow Valley News, October 27th, 1977. At the age of 17 and all alone, Sylvia Christensen's father stepped off the immigrant steamship into the noisy streets of New York City. Fresh from his homeland of Denmark and after 18 days at sea, Ulrich E. Fries was by himself in America with $17 and a ticket to Chicago in his pocket. The year was 1884. After 3 years of working on a farm, adventuring, hoboing, and learning about his new country, he came to Okanagan County. as yet practically unpeopled. My new environment turned out to be a haven of cattle and horse thieves and whiskey peddlers, he said. Nevertheless, he goes on to say in his book, From Copenhagen to Okanagan, the change was an improvement, meaning the rest of the country was far worse. By the spring of this is a quote, by the spring of 1889 and 1890, he writes, I had survived my first hard winter with all my stock, 6 workhorses, a saddle horse, my cattle, and their increase. I was now convinced that I was able to support a wife, and so I wrote to Anna and asked her hand in marriage. Anna accepted, and in 1891, Ulrich sent her $150 and told her to buy a steamship ticket to New York City and a train ticket to Sprague, Washington. Without knowing a word of English, Anna traveled from Copenhagen to Sprague. The day after arriving in Sprague, she was married to Ulrich. 2 days after that, they were rattling along in the rutted roads in their overloaded hack from Cooley City to their homestead through that wild and lonely terrain that even now can seem ominous in its vastness. Anna had never lived away from the sophisticated city of Copenhagen. When they moved into the rough-hewn log cabin, only 4 women lived within a radius of 10 miles. She took all the hardships with grace and set about raising 7 children, one of them Sylvia. Said Ulrich in his book, when I reflect on the citizenship and moral stature of my children, I am convinced that Anna was the most successful teacher of religion and morals that I have ever known. Sylvia, now 80, was the 6th child. My mother always spoke Danish to all of us children, and even when we left home, she wrote in Danish, Sylvia said. It was great for talking on the party line. Ulrich Free's book, From Copenhagen to Okanagan, The Autobiography of a Pioneer, can be read by anyone moving to the area. It was published in 1949. His increase lives throughout the county and in the Methow Valley still. You can find it in the local libraries, and that's still true. Now, this was a real character, Bucky Buckmaster. I don't know how many of you knew Bucky, but he was a trip. I wrote this for the Methow Valley News, September 22nd, 1977. Bucky Buckmaster. The name is well known in the Methow Valley as a mountain packer, farmer, logger, cobbler, and liquor store manager. He has taken part in the valley's life and has added his undeniably salty character to its roster of pioneers. For someone who has survived a broken back, all but 3 ribs broken, a broken neck, a broken leg, a broken arm, 12 heart attacks, intestinal ruptures, infections, emphysema, paralysis of the right leg, and gas, which his wife Paulina says could power a car to go from here to Wenatchee and back, and can still say with a big grin that he has had a lot of fun in his life. That man is not only tough as old jerky, but he has a whopper of a right attitude. Besides, listeners are always tickled by his stories, hyperboles and all. One of his favorite sports, he says, used to be riding up into the hills with fellow packers Ole Scott and Elmer Johnson and seeing if they could get them one of them wild horses that roamed by the hundreds then. He began in the rodeos at the age of 17 as a bareback rider, and it was 5 years before he was ever bucked off. He says, one rodeo held up where the elementary school is. He and Ole took on 27 bucking horses. Boy, was I stiff and sore at the dance that night, Bucky says. Over the years, he packed with the likes of local legends Slim Leonard, Deke Smith, Cliff Libby, Don Ellsworth, and Norm Raynaud. In 1944, Pauline and Bucky, we used to call her Polly. In 1944, Polly and Bucky cut cordwood for a living. They'd put their children on a quilt out of harm's way and would commence to fall and buck 3 cords of wood by crosscut saw. Bucky'd haul it down to Chelan to sell for $15 a cord. He claims he cut 1,000 cords that summer. I've probably cut more wood than anyone in Okanagan County, he says. Polly has a very animated way of talking and is easily able to create a scene from the past. They was packing a mule once, and it got to bucking, she said. The pack boxes weren't covered, and the first thing you know, here comes the coffee, and then a piece of bread, a piece of bread, a piece of bread. And she's flinging her 2 hands up into the air, alternating with each item. Then here comes the bottle of whiskey, a bottle of whiskey. And you know, not a drop was spilled. Bucky hasn't been able to get on a horse for 5 years now, and that fact saddens him. I sure miss them hills, he said. I can't eat the liver-fed fish you get down here in the valley, not after having eaten all those cutthroat trout from the clear, cold mountain lakes. Hospitals have become his second home these last few years. You know, he says with a morose humor, there's only 8 hospitals in the state of Washington I haven't been in, and that's a fact. Okay. How we doing? Okay. Y'all okay now? All right.
Doing great.
Oh, good.
You can't hear us all laughing. We're all laughing our heads off.
Oh, good. I can only see 4 people, so you know I have to swipe to see everybody. But anyway, glad you're having fun. This is a story I wrote about Virgil Webb. Webb is another name that's well known in the Valley. Methow Valley News, October 13th, 1977. Aside from having been a stagecoach driver, mountain packer, wrestler, mechanic, construction worker, farmer, and rancher, store and resort owner, Virgil Webb hasn't done much in his lifetime, unless you count Fitch and mink raiser, woodcutter, whiskey runner during Prohibition, ice house worker, dishwasher on the Columbia River steamboats, firefighter, hunter, prospector, trolley conductor, sawmill worker, and chess player, and husband, father, and grandfather, then maybe you could say, well, maybe this man hasn't been just sitting around playing tiddlywinks all these years. For parts of 3 years, Virgil drove the stagecoach for Eph Davis from Brewster to Winthrop, with intermediate stops at Silver, Filer, and Paradise. The stagecoach trail wound over Benson Hill and by Paradise Creek. Halfway to Benson Creek was the settlement of Filer, with a huge building, the top of which held sleeping rooms, and the ground floor was the eating place and saloon where a livery stable provided fresh horses. Another job of his was hauling ice from the Columbia River. When that river used to freeze solid, he'd cut it and bring the slabs to sheds along the tracks where the Great Northern Railroad train used to stop to take on ice to keep the shipped apples fresh. Men would go out onto the river, cut into the 2-foot thick ice, and saw pieces 50 feet long. They would wrap a choker around it, and the horses would drag the slab from the river. There it was bucked into chunks and stored in the sheds until the next train stopped to claim it. We don't have weather like we used to back then, said Virgil. I remember how the wheat farmers used to wait till the Columbia River froze solid before bringing their sacks of wheat across on bobsleds to load into the trains. Virgil did other kinds of jobs in the Okanagan Valley, not all of them so above board. During Prohibition, he said, I worked for a man over in the Okanagan. He'd have me take a string of pack horses up into Canada, load up on the whiskey, and bring it on back. I never used a named trail. In fact, I didn't use trails at all, and each time I took a different route. They varied 15 miles either side of Chesaw. 3 different times I got caught by a revenuer and had to pay the price. 3 other times I was pursued, but I hid in the hills and I got away with it. With the right kind of Geiger counter, he said, I bet you could find a whole lot of whiskey buried up in those hills. A revenuer could only slap a fine on you if he caught you with the whiskey. Sure, I buried some up there, but I always went back and got it later. That life was a thrill. It was also a living, not a legal living, but a living. Life was a thrill in different ways. Does Jessie Schmidt remember the time when she was on a runaway horse and all of a sudden Virgil was there riding beside her, and then just like the pickup men in the rodeo, Virgil pulled her onto his horse all at a full gallop? Virgil remembers and says with a funny smile, I'm a hero. When Virgil was young and curious, he'd ride his horse from the ranch over the hills to a vantage point where he could look down on the Methow River. What held his attention was a prisoner's stockade. In 1909, 100 inmates from Walla Walla Penitentiary were sent into the valley to help build the road to Pateros. They worked on a chain gang and lived in a high board stockade for several summers while the road was being built. A part of the road they helped construct near the Neff Orchards is still known as the Convict Grade. You up for another one?
You betcha.
Okay. All right, this will be the last one then, about Gladys Waymeyer. And I wrote it for the Methow Valley News, December 1st, 1977. I know a man who stayed in the Methow Valley for 60 years merely because he missed the stagecoach out. I know a couple who has settled here because they made a wrong turn at Pateros and liked what they saw. For others, the fact that they were born here is the quirk of fate that keeps them here. Gladys Lewis Waymeyer has been here for 77 years because at the age of 8 months, her parents wrapped her up warmly, settled her snugly in their covered wagon, snapped the reins, and headed the horses north from Prineville, Oregon. Gladys's parents, Harmon and Zella Lewis, spent a month on the road heading for Winthrop in the fall of 1900, mainly because Zella's uncle, Jack Rizior, kept writing them enthusiastic, glowing accounts of his homestead between the forks of the Methow River and urging them to move up and locate near him. For 2 years, Gladys and her mother and father, sister and brother lived with Jack in his little log house a few miles northwest of Winthrop. When Harmon was finally able to acquire the rights to the adjoining 160 acres, he set out some apple trees. Melted snow was their water source in the wintertime. That is, until one day Gladys's 9-year-old brother, digging around and pretending to be a farmer, struck water. For years, the family drew water from that well. They built up their homestead from scratch, and like every other homesteader of the valley, were resourceful every day of their lives, even with death. There were no undertakers at that time, so if someone died, neighbors prepared the body, dug the grave, and buried the body, usually in Sullivan Cemetery. However, later, several bodies had to be transplanted to that cemetery from outlying homesteads. There was also a ritual of sitting up with the corpse. Gladys tells about the evening someone came to their house and asked her father to come and sit with the body of a baby who had just died. Her father asked no questions, just went, as if keeping the body company during the night was a matter of course. School for Gladys was always a problem. In the winter, her folks would rent a house near the Rockview School, and her mother would live there with the children, while her father stayed on the homestead to feed the cattle and fulfill the residence requirements of a homestead. The Rockview School was one part of the log community hall, which was divided by a canvas curtain. The school years were short, about 5 or 6 months, said Gladys. By and large, we only got a smattering of learning. We never were overburdened with education. In 1912, her father decided there should be a school in their own community, since there were enough homesteaders with children living in the area. The former separate school districts, which were Rockview, French, Bear Creek, and Lakeview, were now consolidated with Winthrop. So Dad consulted with directors and was told that if the community could provide a suitable building, the district would furnish a teacher. Much material was donated, as well as all the labor. S.Q. Grafford gave a 49-year lease on a suitable site. The hall was built and named Grafford Hall. The debt for lumber, windows, etc., was paid off with dances that they held there. Gladys tells a story about her grandmother who had come to the valley in 1909, when she, the grandmother, as a young girl, had crossed the plains to Oregon on a covered wagon. They met a group of Indians where a river had to be forded. In exchange for permitting them to cross the river, the Indians demanded 2 geehaws and a goddamn you. Which meant a team of oxen, that's the 2 geehaws, and a wagon, that's the goddamn you. That's what they called them. In 1917, Gladys married the boy next door, Lou Waymeyer. The Waymeyers had come to the Methow Valley in 1894 before there were any grocery stores. About twice a year, they would hitch up a wagon and drive for 2 days to Coulee City, where they would stock up on supplies. On the 2-day trip back, they hoped they hadn't forgotten anything. After Guy Waring opened a store in Winthrop, shopping got easier. For cereal, for instance, said Gladys, you got to choose between oatmeal and farina. We didn't have to make choices from shelves and shelves of cereal like today. I will say this, the Guy Waring store was sufficient if your wants were simple enough. Gladys and Lou lived in Mazama for 48 years, cleared 30 acres of land for alfalfa, and raised sweet clover for pasture. In 1965, they moved into Winthrop, and Lou passed away in 1968. Gladys has 8 grandchildren and 18 great-grandchildren. If you happen to see a white-haired woman barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel, bombing down the road in her 1966 Falcon, that's Gladys. She's still going strong and knows her own mind in no uncertain terms. What's more, you don't mess with her in a game of pinochle either.